number of years now I've been reading Plato, and I'm very interested in his work, but I was originally repulsed by the way he would write, and the kind of tangled mess that his dialogues actually present to one's appearance did not strike me as beautiful. But after long reflection on his dialogues and an attempt to relate the dialogues systematically, after a number of years, I realized that Plato was creating a new form of reason, or a new form of poetic reason. Said that Plato was a poetic philosopher, and that he's a poet of reason. And so he really was attempting to replace the age of the poets with his own greater Homeric effort at creating a form for the Greeks. And he was really trying to be the center of a new creative effort on the part of the Greeks to become a new civilization, which they had an opportunity to do after the war against the Peloponnesians, or the Peloponnesian War, which was Athens versus Sparta. Plato is known by some to be a Spartiate and to have sympathized with the Spartans in that battle. In the modern period, some people have likened the United States or the U.S. democracy's battle against Germany to be like that of the Athenians versus the Spartans. And I have some sympathy for this perspective, and I do happen to look at it that way. But the most important thing to mention is that Plato is both poet and philosopher, and that he achieves, in his work, he achieves both. And so one could be a very poetically inclined philosopher, or even a pure poet, and read the works of Plato and find great answers to questions like what is poetry in the dialogue Ion, or what is justice, and a great deal of poetic presentations of justice in the Republic, or any number of other dialogues that present also questions like that. One of the fascinating features about the dialogues is their interconnection, as I've suggested in a previous post. One can find, for example, that in Book 1 of the Republic, which is called Thyrasimachus, or Friendship and What Are Friends and Enemies, which is that dialogue. That's the first book of the Republic, or the Valhalla, or the introduction, or the antechamber to the Republic. And so since friendship is raised there, and Socrates is shown in the Phaedrus to be giving a speech about love to a friend in Phaedrus, one can see that the Phaedrus falls within Thyrasimachus, or within the antechamber Thyrasimachus to the Republic. It's really a proemia. The Greek poets would have called it a proemia, or an introductory poem to the Republic. And also the dialogue Lysias, which is on friendship, also falls within the first book of the Republic, Thyrasimachus, because it is actually a question of friendship. And in that first dialogue, Thyrasimachus, Socrates is asking, what are friends and enemies of the Republic, that he constitutes in the later books of the Republic, books 2 through 10. But Plato came along and grew up in the age of Athens, when nihilism and the belief in nothing had afflicted the Athenians, and the Athenians needed a new form of existence. And so his sympathizing with Sparta was the belief that Sparta was the more vigorous and more vital civilization, and that it was the one destined to annihilate democratic Athens and to reform or reconstitute its existence, which indeed it did. Whether or not Plato is guilty, as I believe he is, of being a traitor in Athens and having a number of friends who were traitors and treasonous to the Athenian regime, among them Pericles, is something for the judgment of the reader. But I believe that Plato and Pericles and Alcibiades, there's two dialogues on Alcibiades, that they conspired against the Athenian regime, and they managed to overthrow the democratic regime 2 times, and then for the 3rd time, Plato and his friends succeeded in completely overturning the democracy in the year that Socrates was murdered. So it was a progressive act of apostasy on the part of Plato, who himself was a profound poet in the tradition of Homer. Plato's poetry of reason was spoken in Athens and read in Athens to people. The dialogues were not just written by Plato and meant to be read, they were meant to be enacted before audiences, just like the tragedies and the poetry that was written before. And there's music in them as well. This is just barely being recovered now by J.B. Kennedy in his works, the musical structure of Plato's dialogues. Very eloquent book that attests to the rhythmic and musical character of Plato's dialogues, that they actually has a musical score could be set to each of the dialogues, which of course anybody who knows about the plays in Athens, there was a chorus. So there was music as part of the poetry that was presented in Athens to the Athenians, and this was their religion. This was the Greek religion, a poetry of the gods and a poetry of what was believed by the Athenians. So some 400-500 years before Plato's existence, Homer, he would roam the cities of Athens, or the incipient cities of the Athenian Mycenaean Greece, if you will, and he would actually recite the Iliad and Odyssey for people, which constituted meanings for them and gave them a form to their existence. And that's really the basic idea behind philosophy. In our age, the challenge is for people to rise up and actually create these meanings just as they were created in ancient Greece. But today there's careful control on whether such meanings can actually be created, because in America there's a very careful watch on who gets reputation. So they close off the circle of people who are able to have reputation and honor, and they make that's just Hollywood. See, only people in Hollywood are able to have that kind of reputation and honor, precisely because of the fear that artists in actuality are the conqueror formers of culture and creators of language. Shakespeare, for example, was exactly such a person in creating 75% of the words that we use today were actually created by Shakespeare. So Plato comes along and he thinks he's the greater Homer, or at least he's rivaling Homer. So his dialogues are written as a rival to Homer, and the dialogues of Plato can be read carefully against the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you can see how Plato has a dialogue that will represent each incident in the Odyssey, each incident in the Iliad. So he's got a very careful way of presenting a very subtle, sophisticated, and even esoteric teaching that was meant to be understood in the academy that he constituted after the death of Socrates, according to Eric Voegelin, on the basis of the kind of mythologizing of Socrates' existence and Socrates' questioning. But Plato, as at least one author, or several authors actually that I've read over the years, believe, was skeptical of Socrates' skepticism, and he thought that Socrates' skepticism went too deep to the core of issues about the gods in Athens, and so he was fearful that if the people became too debased by a nihilistic belief in nothing and anti-religious beliefs and atheism, something that was also opposed by Aristophanes, that would corrupt the people, and it would cause them not to any longer be able to worship any religion, and therefore not to be formed as a people. So that's how it was that he reconstituted, if you will, the very poetic basis of Athenian society. Now, Eric Voegelin's Order in History is designed to show that in 5 volumes, how the entire progression of the poets in Volume 2 and what they all believed over the years, and how the Athenians took the poetic meanings and allowed their religion to be constituted by them, how those actually become replaced in the age of Plato by the Platonic dialogues and the ideas that Plato and Aristotle have. Aristotle being a kind of skeptical, where the skepticism sets in and then leads to the Hellenistic age after the death of Plato. But all of this is important to understanding what Plato is. Plato was the founder of a new civilization, a new culture, a new religion, and a new government for the Athenians that has little to do with the previous democratic age. One might suggest that our academy today plays a similar role, but it was not discovered, really. It has not been discovered by our political leaders that something like this change took place in America in the 1960s, and that was the death of American democracy and the rise of a kind of Platonic academy that now has the monopoly on history. And so a lot of the history that is presented on the History Channel, and a lot of what is said about our history and so on, is channeled through things like the Christian teaching as reinterpreted by elements of the academy that are today trying to play from a distance the role that the poet founder Homer, and then the greater Homer, I consider Plato the greater Homer, Plato, conducted apparently in an age 2,500 years ago, but maybe that age is less or more illusory, I should say, and our present age is it's more evident that something like that happened during the Nazi regime, where I think a lot of the tradition, possibly even substantial elements of the Platonic dialogues, were written and introduced into the tradition because of the destruction of Europe, allowed that kind of tampering with tradition or reconstituting of tradition. But the essential point being that a Platonic philosopher has this meaning, that a Platonic philosopher takes the divine and takes the ideas of government and takes the ideas of the people and doesn't just merely reflect them back at the people, but actually tends to constitute the meaning of those things and then formulate it in a poetic way. My friend, he calls Ronnie James Dio the prophet, because he sees that Ronnie James Dio, is actually this kind of singer, that when he sings, he moves the people and he gives them form by his very words. But see, that's not allowed. That's allowed as a religion in our society, but there are too many gods. See, there are too many gods in Hollywood, so the people are confused in their meaning, whereas in the age of Homer, there were no rivals to Homer. There may not have been any rivals to Homer, except you could consider Parmenides, eventually a rival of Homer. You could consider Hesiod to be a rival of Homer. You could consider Aeschylus to be a rival of Homer. You could consider Sophocles to be a rival of Homer, Aristophanes, and so on. But this is the meaning, I think, of Platonic political philosophy, at least as suggested by Leo Strauss in his very important epigram to his law study, which says that everything concerning divine prophecy is contained in Plato's laws. And so, meaning that the philosopher plays the role of divine lawgiver and creator of poetry and creator of poetic meanings, which then allows for the formation of what is called omphalos, a kind of civilizational node or a gravitational node that all the people gather around and then allow themselves to be reconstituted by.